Section 3, Storage and Data Services. Let's go ahead and talk about how we could use the appropriate data services for the right situation, and we'll talk about each of these briefly as well with some demos as part of the course. So when it comes to Amazon capabilities, we're going to really focus again on storage services such as S3. We'll get into Elastic Block Store, also EFS as well, and then we'll talk about other data services such as data warehouses, databases, and then we'll get into how to migrate as well to AWS your data from on-prem, for example. So there's a lot of different migration options that we want to cover. We have a lot to cover, so let us proceed on to the next module. Storage and database services. Let's talk about the available services with Amazon storage capabilities. Now, there's quite a bit of services around the storage domain. I want to focus on the main ones. I've got numerous demos coming up to talk about these, but basically we want to first focus on Amazon S3. Amazon S3 is really all about scalable, affordable block storage. Now, Amazon S3 is one of Amazon's oldest services, been around since pretty much day one, and it really is meant to store data as an object within typically a bucket. Now, basically an object is basically going to be a file. It's going to have metadata that describes it, and basically with the buckets we're going to store basically objects in the buckets. Pretty straightforward. Now, I'll talk more about S3 in the upcoming module, such as the storage classes and other areas such as pricing. Now, Elastic Block Store is basically block storage that's meant to be primary storage that we're going to attach to an EC2 instance. Then we have Amazon Glacier. Amazon Glacier is basically an archive solution. It's meant for long-term storage, basically compliance requirements. It's meant to store what is called cold data. It's not really needing to be available, but we need to have it ready in case we have an audit or some kind of restore requirement. Basically, Glacier is going to allow us to retrieve an archive and basically bring it back as needed. It's very inexpensive to store in Glacier. However, there's cost to retrieve data basically as we need it. It basically uses what's called vaults and archives and all that. There's inventory requirements. But for Glacier, again, that's more focused on archive and compliance. And then we have EFS and FSX. So EFS is Elastic File Store. It's really meant to be similar to network attached storage. It's meant to be file storage. It is a very good solution in circumstances where you probably have a distributed workforce and you need a NAS share. It's probably the main use case in my own experience and opinion. But basically the service is really meant to manage your file storage. It also allows you to deploy configs for patching, etc. It also supports NFS, of course. Version 4 is really where the current level of support is for EFS. It allows you as well to attach EC2 instances with the file system as well. So that, again, is one of the main use cases. There's different performance modes, throughput modes, etc. that you can consider. Now, FSX is an interesting solution because it's essentially a managed third-party system that's used. It's really meant to provide low latency, high performance storage. The main use case is really for file systems that really need to basically have multiple access to multiple users at the same time. It's, again, similar to EFS, but this is basically a third-party system, whereas EFS is really an Amazon-based system. Now, with EFS, another thing to be aware of too is that it supports Lustre. It's really a high-performing file system that is meant to support what is called a parallel file system. And again, that's probably the main use case. And then we have the database domain. So we have our database solutions. We had talked about these earlier. Again, some of these are sort of redundant, some of these are not. But basically, we want to be aware that there's Aurora, RDS, DynamoDB, and Redshift. We know that RDS is a relational data service. It supports multiple databases from Oracle to MariaDB to MySQL. Aurora supports, for example, SQL. It's a relational database as well, but it's an Amazon proprietary service as well. Now, when it comes to, for example, other solutions that we could use for data services, one of the popular ones now that I see quite a bit is called DynamoDB. That's a NoSQL solution. It's a database that's really meant to provide basically high performance and predictable performance. It uses what's called database tables as part of its structure, allows you to scale up and scale down. Also, too, it's very similar, of course, to SQL in some of the structure. It is a popular, easy-to-use service. It does have those specific attributes that are different than SQL, called scalar types, document types, and set types. So we could go ahead and, for example, select the type of documents that we could add to the data structure. We could also create nested solutions. So if we want JSON, for example, we could do that, whatever we want. So nice capability. Now, also to storage migration, this is, again, a big deal. You really need to figure this out when you're ready to migrate your resources to AWS. Now, I won't go through all of these per se, but I will go through in the demos each of these pretty much. I think it's important to get an idea of where these are. There is a database migration service. It'll support SQL effectively and lets you bring in your on-prem SQL to AWS. There's also Cloud Endure. That's an additional service that you could use as well. And then there's basically migration tools, I guess is the way I could sum it up. But basically, when we think of migrations, we need some kind of way to be able to migrate basically from on-prem to AWS. So that's where Snowball and Snowmobile come in. Now, Snowball is meant to transfer large amounts of data, and it uses a physical device, very similar to what you see here. And it's meant to basically support 50 terabytes or 80 terabytes, basically. And I have a brief discussion on that coming up, basically, as well. And then we have a Snowmobile, and there's also, actually, I should say, a Snowball Edge as well. Now, Snowball Edge has greater scalability and better support. It does support clustering as well. Snowball doesn't. So there's actually right here, I just want to point that out, there's Snowball and then Snowball Edge. So Snowball is, again, really meant to import data, export data, but it doesn't have basically local storage, nor does it really support EC2 instances as well, or IoT or NFS. That's what Snowball Edge does. So that's sort of that same component. And then I think we need to talk about basically storage gateway, for example. And storage gateway is actually a great capability for a hybrid cloud. This is where you have on-prem and AWS clouds basically running at the same time. It has different gateways, and these gateways are meant to integrate basically your application services between on-prem and AWS. Now, storage gateway has different types of gateways. There's a file gateway. It's meant to interface with the S3 basically. And then there is a volume gateway. This is an iSCSI based solution. Then there's a tape gateway. Basically, the tape gateway is to back up data into Glacier basically. And then there's different hosting options that can be used. I won't go into everything. I will talk about Migration Hub as well and Cloud Endure coming up. But basically, Migration Hub is basically a portal you go to see how your migrations are coming along. Gives you that one-stop view of everything that might be going on. Let's go ahead now and proceed to the next module and talk more about Amazon S3. Amazon S3. Now, Amazon S3 is a service that has been around probably the longest with Amazon. It was the first service that was publicly available, and it was released again in the late 2006 or 7, somewhere in there. I think it was about 7. And effectively, it's been around a long time. So there's a huge user base for S3. Amazon S3 is known as Amazon Simple Storage Service. It is an object storage service that provides great scalability, availability, security, and performance. It is very easy to use. It also is designed to be available and can store, again, any number of applications, any kind of data effectively. And S3 uses basically what is called a bucket. Basically, a bucket is going to be a place where objects will be stored. And again, fairly straightforward from that perspective. I'll walk you through a demo. It's easier to see. And then S3 does support access points. These are similar to basically a endpoint where you get access the resources via API. Tiers. Now, tiers, of course, are used to ensure that you as a customer have the right level of availability and performance and cost. Life cycles manage basically the data that is in your S3 buckets. And for example, data does get stale. Maybe what you want to do is create a life cycle, move that data out of basically the standard tier into a lower tier that might save a little bit of money. It does support monitoring. We could integrate, of course, CloudWatch with it. Data transfer and IAM, of course, supports data transfer capabilities. Now also too, with data transfer, basically there's utilities out there to migrate data to S3. And also too, with IAM, we have the ability to, of course, create basically budgets, not budgets, but buckets. And as part of buckets, we could specify basically who can access what bucket and how, make the buckets publicly available or just private only. Now, when it comes to basically the different tiers, I'll talk about those here in a second. But these tiers basically, again, also known as storage classes, basically address a specific use case. So for example, standard is really meant for your frequently accessed data. It is the highest performing on S3. Intelligent tier is meant for basically data that is really meant to optimize costs and then adjust the patterns as well. So maybe that data is used for 2 weeks constantly, and then after 2 weeks, it's not used until the end of the month. again. So we could basically use tiering to deal with patterns and also address cost issues as well. And then we have basically infrequent access. Now, this is basically a way we could basically address, for example, data that needs to be available but not really needed on a higher tier. So what we want to think about is, do we need to store that data, for 30 days or more, or do we not? These are some things we want to consider. And then Glacier is really meant for archive effectively as well. And here's a table that is pretty helpful in understanding what the storage classes are and basically the use cases that go along with them and what they support. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that as you see here, they all support 11.9s. However, availability is, again, going to change based on what you need. Again, 99.5 is one zone IA. That just basically says you're keeping that in one zone in that region. And again, you're not replicating that, so you are saving some costs. SLA, as you see, can be different as well. And then the number of availability zones that the replication is going to handle is there. With that said, let's now proceed on to some demos on S3 and learn more about Amazon S3 and its features. In this demo, let's go ahead and create an Amazon S3 storage bucket. Let's select S3. That'll bring us over to the bucket list. There's currently 3 buckets. Let's create a new bucket. When we create a bucket, the first thing to be aware of is that the bucket name needs to be unique. This is a global namespace that S3 uses, and therefore we need to create a name that no one else has taken. Let's go ahead and call this AWS bucket. And let's just say it is going to be 9999, just a couple nines or whatever, just to pretty much give it guarantee it'll be unique. And then let's go ahead and make sure that block all public access is set. Go ahead and create the bucket. That bucket has been created. Let's select that bucket. And what we want to do is add some files to the bucket. Let's go ahead and select upload. And I'll go ahead and just select 2 files here. And you can see that they're there now, 2 PDF files. Let's go select next. I'm going to leave the manage users the same, the account permissions the same in this case by default. Now, this is where we need to determine what storage class we will leave our bucket on. Now, when it comes to S3, generally standard is, of course, the default. And this will make sure that your data is, of course, distributed between 3 or more availability zones. And that is going to give you the most amount of availability options that you can select. So standard is really the default. However, we could also change this to intelligent tiering, standard IA, one zone, Glacier, or Glacier Deep archive. Now I have a separate demo on Glacier. We'll cover that in the next demo. And this is a review. We just want to make sure it looks the way we want it. Go ahead and upload. And it has uploaded 1, and now we have 2 files. Let's go back to the bucket list. And you could see that public access is not open, not public for the next one. But this one here, Elastic Beanstalk, is actually open to the public. That's because it's a Hello World app. Let's go ahead and select that one we just created, and the 2 files are there. That is how you would create a bucket, relatively simple. And also, too, when we go to the bucket overview, We could also go over to properties. We could also set up versioning. We could also set logging as well on the bucket, and also set logging on the server as well. Could always change the permissions if we want. And then management, we could add a lifecycle rule. Now, a lifecycle rule is going to allow us to say, for example, after 3 months, this data may not need to be on standard, which is going to cost more money than what we might want to pay, and we could downgrade it to maybe standard-IA. And that way we can just save some costs and just basically create a lifecycle and move from one tier to another. And then access points. These are used basically to access resources in S3. We have a couple approaches to doing that. It's a little bit more secure than just, of course, leaving the bucket open. Create an access point is also a good idea. That's the overview of S3 buckets. Let's move on. In this demo, let's go ahead and deploy Amazon S3 Glacier. Now, Glacier is essentially Amazon S3 object storage, but it is meant for long-term storage classes. And it's really used as a method to meet archive or compliance requirements. Let's go ahead over here and type in S3. And you can see here when we select S3, we have S3 Glacier. This will bring us over to Amazon S3 and allows us to create a vault. When we select a vault, and basically a vault is an archive. When we select vault, we want to first, of course, determine the region. And because I'm in the Ohio region here, it's going to default to that. So just be aware. If I want to deploy this in Virginia or another location, Europe, whatever, I would need to go to that region and then configure this. I'm going to call this the AWS Fundamentals archive. And then what we want to do is set notifications. In this case, I'm going to not enable notifications, but let's say that you do want to get notified, for example, when the archive has completed. You go ahead and set that up here. And then I just go ahead and submit. So now I have a vault basically created. Now, I then would select the vault, and this is where I need to start setting up the vault. For example, I would select notifications, permissions, vault lock, and then tags. And again, that's going to be the starting point. And then over here to settings, this is where I would select where do I want to set the data retrieval settings to. Do I want to use a free tier? Is there a limit or not a limit? And the costs are listed here as well. And that is essentially how you would get started. And then you would delete the vault here. Now, a couple other things to talk about as well. First, if you remember in the S3 demo, we had the option to select Glacier. So let's go back to the basically Amazon S3. We'll stay here in this window. And then let's go over here to S3. Let's go ahead and create a bucket. I'm going to call this Glacier bucket 1. That's probably going to be taken. Sounds too easy, but we'll see. Create the bucket. Yep, someone got it. Okay, let me just put in some numbers. As you see, it is a global namespace. Now, basically, we have the bucket created, but we're not really done. We need to go over here to basically a few things. Well, first of all, we need to upload some data. And let me go ahead and add a couple files here. Go next. Permissions are set. And this is where we want to select Glacier. can see there that this is going to be an archive. There's also deep archive. Basically, this is going to be longer term, and the retrieval time is a little different. But in this case, Glacier is what we want to use. And then we're going to upload. And you could see that that has completed. And if you want to, for example, select this, you go ahead and get the total size of the archive. It's 44 meg. And we go back to archive actions, that is. We could also restore that as well. And we could also create a folder, which is going to be basically similar to creating a file structure in the bucket. Not really a NAS share, but just gives you some kind of informal structure that you could use. Go over here to properties. I could also go over to, let's just see here, right down here, advanced settings. I get add tags. Another thing you want to do is add tags, of course. And I think that's probably good for that. And then over here, we get always open up the bucket policy, the management. This is where we could add a lifecycle. And I could just add a lifecycle, basically moving, for example, data on standard tier back down to archive if I want, or back down to Glacier, whatever I prefer. So those are just some of the things that we could do. And then we could also set up replication with it. Analytics is available. Again, just talking about S3 is literally a good 4 or 5 hours generally in a 3-day class. So there's a lot here to talk about. Now, generally in this case with Glacier, we want to, of course, be aware that there's a lot of features and functions that we want to pay attention to. So we created our Glacier bucket. We also, over here, added a vault as well. So what we would do typically next is just create basically an archive and then vault it off. That would be typically the next step. And for the purposes of this demo, we'll go ahead and move on to the next subject. In this demo, let's go ahead and create an S3 lifecycle. Let's go to S3. And then what we want to do is go over and select one of these buckets. I'll just pick the first one. Next thing we want to do is go over to properties and just double check a few things here. You could see that, okay, those look okay. Disabled, disabled, disabled. Okay, great. And then let's go over to management. Now, as far as management is concerned, this is where we would go to set up a lifecycle. And replicate, analytics, metrics, and inventory is also available. What we want to do is add a lifecycle rule. Let's go ahead and call this basically S3 Demo. And then I'm going to add tags. I'm going to just say, let's see, AWS course, let's say, as a prefix. I'll just put AWS. And okay, that took it there. You do have to hit enter, just be aware of that. And that's one way we could start limiting the life cycle to a specific prefix, for example, or a tag, or we could go apply to all objects in the bucket. In this case, I'm just going to apply to all objects in the bucket. Go next. And then I can go ahead and select the version. Now, basically, there's a current version and there's a previous version as well. Basically, again, this is just basically a life cycle transition. And there is basically, if you had an older bucket version set up, you want to select that, or you could just basically current versions of the objects, or you could select a previous version as well. So it really just depends. I'll just say current, in this case. And then what I want to do is basically expiration. I'm just going to leave it as probably both of these, and then just say 7 days. Just leave it at the default. And it just says it'll basically apply the rules to all objects in the bucket. And basically what it's going to do is clean up incomplete multi-part uploads as part of one of the lifecycle rules. So for example, if something was uploaded to that bucket and the file didn't get fully received, it would just go ahead and clean that up, for example. And then we could add another rule as well, again, whatever we want to call it, apply it to all the objects, for example, and then just say previous version. Current version. And basically we will put in like how long, whether it would be a year, etc. And then again, if I don't want to select that, I can go ahead and select cleanup objects. And it basically tells you that it overlaps with another policy. So if you go back here, you can see that that was already selected. If I go here to previous versions, I go over here, it says it overlaps again. So this is, again, a way that it's going to let you know if there's some kind of conflict. However, to get around that, let's say we know, for example, that one of the documents, for example, might have AWS in the prefix or the tag. Again, we go ahead and select that and go ahead and add the filter. And make sure you hit enter. It's not totally obvious, so just be aware of that. And then previous versions, I can go next. And then it says it overlaps again. That's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and save it. And again, you could go ahead and see that it was really all we have to do to create a lifecycle rule. And again, I go enable this rule. You disable it. And that will go ahead and delete that permanently, for example. Then if I go back there, you can see that in this folder, there's two files. And again, if I have put in like Google, again, that's a way to move this basically out of there to set up a lifecycle, for example. This is just one of the many things we could do with S3 storage. In this demo, let's deploy an EFS share. Now, EFS is basically an elastic file system or file storage, actually, and it's meant to create a NAS share which you would attach to an EC2 instance. You can see that there is one here already, and I go ahead and create a file system. The first thing we want to do is, of course, select the proper VPC. Make sure that we select the right targets. Now remember the VPC, we need to ensure that we are selecting the right availability zones that we want to deploy in. And if we have EC2 instances in, let's say, US West, then that's great. If we don't, then we need to, of course, select the proper availability zone that we want to deploy in. Going to go and go over to, let's see here. I'm going to skip over tags for this. Lifecycle we'll skip over. Performance mode. Now, performance mode is basically going to be GP in most cases. Max IO will give you a little bit better aggregate. However, it may or may not be consistent. When it comes to policy settings, we can set the policy settings, of course, access points that we'd want to use. And basically, this is at the default VPC. Availability zones is US West. And then we would create the file system. That'll go ahead and create the file system. You can see now that I have two different VPCs listed here. And again, When I attach it, it'll go ahead and pick up the EC2 name. And I also can manage throughput mode, client access as well, for example. And again, I go back to where I was earlier. So I have some choices with that. That is how simple it is to deploy an EFS share. Then if we wanted to attach it, we then could go into EC2 and get that set up. In this whiteboard, let's go ahead and put together basically some scenarios where we might want to use different types of storage or database solutions. Basically, we want to think about, first of all, the use case. Generally, one of the services we'll likely be using would be S3. Now, S3 is object storage. It's meant for ingestion. We could use it as a data pool, whatever we may need to use it for. Now, for example, with S3, we may want to use, for example, other services such as SNS. For example, we may want to send messages when someone drops a bucket, drops something into a bucket, let's say. And you can see here I have two different blocks. Basically, S3 and SNS is in this VPC, so this is really one virtual private cloud. Let's say this is for developers. And then in this VPC, VPC2, we might be running like RDS. That might be relational data service. And then we're running EC2. And because we're running EC2 and we want to have basically block data accessible with EC2, we may want to use basically Elastic, let's see, block store. And again, very simple to set up. So basically what we could do is set up our EC2 instance, have basically reference EBS, and as part of that, we could be also running a SQL database, or we could be running any kind of number of applications on EC2 that might need to use Elastic Block Store. For example, we might be running SQL, we might be running Cassandra-based services, whatever that is, Hadoop, on EC2. On the other hand, we may actually be running relational data service, for example. That might be something we want to consider. And also, too, we could also use with EC2 what is called EFS. That is basically a NAS file structure, basically in the cloud. It's a native file structure with AWS. So it's called the Elastic File System. It is meant to provide this for what is essentially Linux workloads. It's not meant for Windows, just be aware of that. And then over here, what we could do is, let's say we have developers and then we have production engineers. We may want to set up basically an access to this VPC for that group, and then access to this VPC to that group. Again, we could set this scenario up any number of different ways. So if we're using S3, SNS, let's just say in that case, or we're using RDS, EC2, etc., we want to make sure developers use their resources and then the production engineers use their resources, for example. And again, this is just any number of scenarios I could go through. Let's go ahead and move on. Now, as far as other data services and databases, storage, etc., there is a whole list of other services that we generally don't have time to cover in an introductory course. These range from everything from Neptune to Redshift to QLDB, which is a ledger, distributed ledger, document database, Cassandra as well. Then also to Storage Gateway and AWS Backup. Now, there's also other services that we haven't had a lot of time to go through, like AI and machine learning, analytics services, for example. One of the more common ones is EMR that you might run into. EMR is basically Elastic MapReduce. This is really meant to target towards developers, and it actually, in conjunction, will use S3 as part of this process. You create a cluster for your configuration. And again, this is another nice tool that's out there for developers. With that said, I just wanted to touch on the fact that there's other services, but those are beyond the scope of this course, so let's go ahead and move on. Amazon RDS. Now, RDS is Amazon's relational database service. It is meant for you to deploy, operate, and of course, scale your relational database in AWS. It is really meant for you to choose basically a database engine and just get started immediately. For example, we could use Aurora, PostgreSQL, MySQL. I think Oracle is of course supported now, and SQL Server. It also does support the database migration service as well. So there's really 5 or 6 choices as far as our database engine. Now, to get started, what we want to do is create a database. And you can see that the wizard is pretty straightforward. Do we want to do a standard create or an easy create? And if we go easy create, we could go ahead and select the configuration. Let's say MySQL. I'm going to use this for dev and test. You can see here it's going to give us an identifier for the instance. Master username, we put in a password here. And we simply create the database. That is the quickest way to get started with RDS. So that'll go ahead and create a database, and that'll take a little time. We'll come back when it's done and see the status. So it's still progressing. You'd see it says creating, and that'll take a little bit more time, and we'll come back. So the RDS database has pretty much completed. It is just backing itself up right now. You can see there that it is an instance. It's MySQL. It's in US East 2B. It's backing up. No current activity at this point. If I select the DB identifier, this will allow me to drill down into that instance. And again, you could see that I have a security group already set up, a CEDAR range, and again, a lot more information. Just wanted to show you a quick demo of how it is deployed really simply to set up and actually deploy. As far as monitoring, you can monitor it. You can see the CPU utilization, the storage, the memory used, IOPS, etc. Logging is also supported. You can create an alarm if you want. Events are listed here. And then we go over here to create a read replica. We could take a snapshot. We could also migrate that snapshot as well. And then if we want, there's a query editor as well. We could also migrate data to the database as well. That is RDS. Let's move on to the next session. AWS Migration Hub. Now, this is where you want to go to really get started on understanding where to basically start your migration process. It is supported only in specific regions. So for example, let's go to US West. And you can see here that this will pop up the Migration Hub. The goal of Migration Hub is to help you discover what you have in your data center and how to bring it to AWS. The first thing you want to do is to discover, which is to import your data, and then basically get recommendations, and then connect your services. And if you go over here, get started with discovery, it brings up this basically flow chart that will help you out, or list is really probably what it is, where it gives you basically first how to discover, how to migrate, and then how to track the status. Migration Hub is really more of a portal, a dashboard that you can use to pull together all your migrations that you're performing with AWS. And again, you go here to import. Now, if you had, for example, in US West, this would be your home region. And as part of this, again, as part of discovery, you would be able to start identifying, for example, when you go to discover, how to bring in your data, how to connect your data. It does support VMware vCenter. And there's discovery agents that you could load on your VMs or physical servers. This will help you identify what can be migrated to AWS. And when you select import, there's a template that you could download, for example. And then the discovery connector, this is an agentless connector that you could use that'll identify performance of your VMs. And then, of course, the discovery agent. And then there's partner solutions that you could use as well. Over here, for example, if you already performed discovery, you want to go to migration directly. Now, we did talk about Cloud Endure as well during the course, so that is available. You could connect that to that. And it also gives you another option of ATA data. And this is mainly for API integration is what it looks like. But Cloud Endure has been around a while. It is a free tool you could use, and it really is going to help you identify your workloads, your VMs, that you could bring over to AWS. With that said, that is the Migration Hub. The dashboard is here. Once you get started, this will start populating essentially. Now, AWS, as we're aware, does have migration tools. They do supply what is a physical device to help you migrate. And I just want to point out basically what is called the Snow family. And here is the members of the family. We have AWS Snowball. This is meant for petabyte scale data transfer. This is basically the size of a suitcase. Then Snowball Edge, again, is also similar, but this is meant to be placed in a rack, more or less. And it is really meant to be shelved at the edge, and generally, as it says, remote locations as well. So that's really the difference. They're really about the same. It's just the use case is a little bit more specialized with the Snowball Edge, that is. Now, Snowmobile is really meant for massive scale. This is when they ship in a truck with a container on it that you would be able to move up to 100 petabytes of data. And again, this is a large truck that they're going to bring in to handle this. Here's the specs on knowing which one does what. Snowball is 50 terabytes and 80 terabytes. Snowball Edge is 100 terabytes. And Snowmobile is 100 petabytes. That's a lot of data. And you can see there are some more specs on this. Now, to get one of these, there's a cost for that, of course. And the service as well if you need help with it from a partner. And this gives you information on this. That is the Snow family. Let's move on. Let's go ahead and talk about migrating virtual machines to AWS. Now, one of the first things we want to be cognizant of is, of course, are we going to migrate from on-prem, or are we going to migrate from the cloud? Now, some tools can do either or, depends on what you're trying to use. For example, Cloud Endure migration is really a nice way that we could use. Basically, so just to clarify, AWS Cloud Endure is an AWS company now. Previously, it was a third party, but AWS had bought them, and now Cloud Endure is now an AWS party. They have Cloud Endure migration, which is going to basically take, for example, your on-prem resources and migrate them over to EC2. And it'll also do this the same as with your cloud resources in another cloud provider, such as Google Cloud, and migrate them over as well to AWS. Now, when using Cloud Endure, it can migrate basically physical, virtual, or from another cloud. So you could use also, for example, VMware. Now, one thing we could also consider as well is that if we want to migrate a database, there is also, and I didn't put it down here, an AWS migration database service. Now, down here we have third-party tools which are available in the marketplace. There's also a tool called CART, and then there's also the AWS Migration Hub, which is available in the console. Now, these tools that are available, some provide basically synchronized migrations or basically step migrations, live migrations. Each of these have different values to them. The Migration Hub is actually more of a what I would call more of a portal to review your migration that is going on, and that's really the value of that. Basically, when we perform a migration, we first want to consider a few things. The first thing is we have to know what we have, and then we're going to start, basically collecting that information and start mobilizing, basically clarifying that all our VMs are migratable. And then we want to go ahead and then migrate. Oops, I could spell that right. Okay, and then we want to migrate. And that's really the three-step process. Now, a couple other things too. For example, when we're considering like mobilizing, there are some additional services that are available. One is called the AWS Application Discovery Service. And then also partners do have solutions as well, like you could hire a service to come in and take care of this. Again, a lot of different options. Professional services can do it as well. Whatever you feel like. But getting from on-prem or the cloud to AWS is not much of an issue. So just be aware that there are options.